Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this webinar between PPMD and NS Pharma. NS Pharma is joining us to talk through two of their clinical trials for two new investigational products, Brogidirsen and NS-050, which are exon skipping therapies for patients amenable to exon skipping of 44 and exon 50. And we are joined today by Dr. Vamshi Rao from Lurie Children's, who will go through some of the information for the clinical trials, and Leslie Magnus, who's the VP of Medical Affairs at NS Pharma, to give a little bit of background on NS. So we are recording this webinar, so if you have any friends or family who would find this relevant and they're not able to join us today, please let them know. It will be up on PPMD's website in the following week. And then we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So we've had some questions submitted ahead of time. But if you have any questions that come up while the presentation is ongoing or during the Q&A, there is a chat function at the bottom of your screen. And you can just submit your questions there. And we will try to get to as many of those as we can when we go to the Q&A portion. And so with that, I think we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to hand it over to Leslie to get us started.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric. And thank you to PPMD for hosting this webinar. On behalf of NS Pharma, I'd like to welcome everyone to this session, and I hope you find it very useful. What we'd like to present today, as Eric mentioned, is some information about NS Pharma, and then some information about our two new studies that are just starting up with two new exon skipping oligonucleotides. So if I could have the first slide, please. For those of you who may not know NS Pharma yet, we are a company based in Paramus, New Jersey, and you can see a picture of our office there on the right. We are a wholly owned US subsidiary of a Japanese company called Nippon Shinyaku. And our main areas of focus are rare diseases, including Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and also hematological oncology products. We are conducting the DMD clinical development program based out of the offices here in Paramus, New Jersey. As I mentioned, our parent company is based in Kyoto, Japan, and they were founded over 100 years ago. So it's an old, venerable company in Japan. They too focus on rare diseases and hematology oncology products, but in addition have products in the urology and gynecology space. Next slide, please. This slide shows the developmental milestones for Viltolarsen, but the area to focus on most is the one in the bold blue box, which was August 2020, when Viltepso, as Viltolarsen is known, received approval here in the US. It was also approved about 6 months before that in Japan, and those are the two countries which have commercially available Viltepso. Next slide, please. And here you see the pipeline for NS Pharma, and you can see the Exon 53 skipping agent, which was approved in the US and Japan. And then in descending order, we see Exon 44, which has now entered clinical trials, Exon 50, which has now entered clinical trials, and those two will be discussed in just a moment. And then slightly behind that, still in the preclinical phase, are exons 41, 51, and 55 skipping agents. We also are very excited that we are partners with Capricor Therapeutics, who have CAP-1002, also in the clinical development phase. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Rao for discussion of the two currently starting studies.
Hi, everybody. This is Vamshi Rao. I hope you can hear me clearly. I am going to talk about these two new exon skipping trials, as Leslie and Eric alluded to, in terms of the new therapies that are going to be in clinical trials. One of them is Brogidirsen, which is an exon 44 amenable skip therapy, and NS-050 or NCNP-03, which is an exon 50 a trial for exon 50 amenable mutations. I'm a neuromuscular neurologist at the Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago, and I have my faculty appointment at Northwestern University. So with that, let's get into the first clinical trial. But before we get into what the clinical trial is about, just some results from a phase 1/2 study of the NS-089 NCNP-03, an exon 44 skipping drug in patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. This was presented at the World Muscle Society Congress in 2022. And as we get into it, we could see that the patients who were part of this had these certain characteristics. This study was done using two dose levels, 40 milligram per kilogram and 80 milligram per kilogram. And each of these arms had 3 patients. You can see that the patient age characteristics in the table. For the 40, the mean age was 9 years old, and for 80, it was 8.7. There were 2 different types of exon deletion, both of them amenable to 44, and hence were in the study. In the 40 milligram per kilogram group, all of them were exon 45 mutations, and in 80, it was 45 to 54. 2 of them were 45, and 1 of them 45 to 54. Majority of these patients in both arms were on steroids, except 1 patient in the 40 milligram per kilogram arm that wasn't on steroids. The results of the study show that there was definitely a dose-dependent increase in dystrophin levels. So if you look at the 40 milligram per kilogram, the bar that is gray versus the bar in blue. The bar in blue are patients the bar in blue is the increase after treatment from 6.4% to 16.6%. And there's a increase also in the 80 milligram per kilogram group. If you put them together cumulatively, you will notice that of all the treated patients, the increase from baseline to week 24 was almost 13.1%, as evidenced in the bar graphs on the extreme right. And this increase, percent increase, was statistically significant. And as you can see from the 2 groups, that this was a dose-dependent increase, as I alluded to earlier. There was also a mean change of 32% in the exon skipping efficiency from baseline to week 24, which was also statistically significant, and was and there was an evidence of dose-dependent increase in that too. An important thing to note here is that there were no drug-related serious adverse effects that were reported, and no patients discontinued the study. All 6 of them completed the study. So with that in our mind and as a background, what we are going to just inform you about is this phase 2 exon 44 skipping trial named Discover in boys with DMD. And the Discover study is going to look at 20 ambulant boys that are amenable to exon 44 skipping. Their age will range from 4 to 14 years old. This drug, Brogidirsen, is going to be given as a weekly IV infusion. Children need to be on a stable dose of glucocorticoids for at least or equal to 3 months. There are 2 parts to the study. Part 1 of the study is 12 weeks. It's a multiple ascending dose study, and they're looking at 6 participants. And safety in this part 1 is going to be checked at each of the 3 dose levels. Then there's going to be a part 2, which is going to be for 24 weeks. And part 2 is going to involve taking what we have learned from part 1 as the maximum tolerated dose, and then have 20 children be dosed with that. Now, 14 of these children are going to be new, but 6 of them are actually going to roll over from part 1 into part 2. Dystrophin levels will be measured as a part of this study. And so procedures that will be included in a snapshot here, to give you an idea, will be muscle biopsies. There will be blood draws, urine collections, physical exams, MRI testing, and function assessments that are going to tell us about their motor change. Now, the key exclusion criteria to mention is, in this study, anybody who has received any gene therapy or any other exon skipping therapy will be excluded. They will also be excluded if they've had any other investigational drug within 3 months before the first dose of the study drug. Now, for a complete list of inclusion-exclusion criteria, we definitely can have folks talk to their providers and get more information about specific things that they need. But these are really a highlight of the key inclusion and the key exclusion criteria as detailed on the slide here. These are the sites on the US map. It is a US study for now, and these are the sites that are going to participate in the study. As you can see, they do draw from different geographic locations to allow for maximum participation. Now, changing gears and talking about the next study, which is a phase 1/2 study of NS-050 NCNP-03 in boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and this is called the Meteor 50 study. And this is a study that is going to be for children who are amenable to exon 50 skipping. This study is going to involve 20 ambulant boys, ranging again from 4 to 14 years old. It is also a drug that is given via IV infusion, and children have to be on a stable dose of glucocorticoid for at least 3 months. The procedures are similar as was detailed in the 44 study. Children are going to have muscle biopsies, blood will be drawn, samples of urine will be taken. There are going to be physical exams throughout the study. MRI testing is going to be used, and there is going to be motor function assessments to look for change. The key exclusion criteria for the exon 50 skipping therapy is that if you have received any gene therapy, you're going to be excluded from the study. And if you have received any other investigational drug within 3 months before the first dose of the study drug, the children will be excluded from the study. Now, the Meteor 50 study design also has 2 parts. Now, part 1 is the multiple ascending dose part. Here, we're going to have 9 ambulant children, ranging from 4 to 14, that are going to go through these ascending dose design, which would range from 1.95 milligram per kilogram per week to 5, 10, 20, 40, and 80 as the maximum. What's important to note here is that the Data Safety and Monitoring Board will convene after each dose level to evaluate that the drug is safe, and to also determine if this study may proceed to the next dose level. So part 1 essentially is a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial. What's important to note here is that there is going to be, for every 2 children in the treatment arm, a child in the placebo. So the ratio of treatment to placebo here is 2:1. We're then going to proceed to the part 2 of the study. And part 2 will involve the children who were in part 1, 9 of them that participated in part 1. They're going to roll over into part 2. And then there are going to be 11 additional children in part 2. So part 2 is going to be made up of 20 children. The children who are already in part 1 will directly go into part 2, and the maximum tolerated dose that was used in part 1 is going to be started on these children. Now, the children who are new and are enrolling in part 2, 11 of them, so to speak, are actually going to go through the screening period just to make sure that they're eligible. And then the maximum tolerated dose that we have learned from part 1 is going to be administered in these children. There are going to be muscle biopsies, as you can see from those diamonds, the unfilled diamonds in the timeline there. The IV administration, this drug is going to be administered IV once weekly, as we talked about earlier. And participants who are completing this study will be eligible for a separate open label extension part. Right now, there is one site that is listed, but there is a plan for additional sites to be announced. And for more information on studies in general and on sites in particular, and these two studies, information can be found on clinicaltrials.gov. There's also contact information here. There's a phone number listed if you want to take that down. And as Eric alluded to earlier, this is a recorded session, so it will be available to you. But there are QR codes too. And there are specific QR codes if you want information for the Exon 44 skipping trial versus the Exon 50 skipping trial. So with that, I wanted to end this presentation, and thank you for your attention. But most importantly, thanks to PPMD to allow NS Pharma and myself to inform you about these upcoming studies. Eric, back to you.
Thanks, Dr. Rao. So as we kind of go through this, if you have questions that come up, again, please submit them to the chat function. I saw a number come in during the talk, and we have some that were submitted ahead of time. Dr. Rao, if we could go back to slide 4. One of the questions that we had was around, and this is probably a little bit more for Leslie, NS Pharma's plan in terms of kind of pipeline development. So you obviously have Viltepso for Exon 53. You have the current trials for your Exon 44 and 50. There was a question around the other exons that were being explored. And so, you can see here some of the ones that you're looking at. Are you looking at other exons, potentially expanding out NS Pharma's pipeline? And are you able to talk at all about kind of timeline for these other exons?
As we see here on the slide, on the timeline slide, exons 45, 51, and 55 are the ones that are up next. They are still in the preclinical phases, which means it's still in animal testing and all those types of testing. And so we don't have a firm date as to when it will be first into man. So when it will become, the development will have been completed enough for us to be able to move it into man. So it would be difficult to speculate as to what the timing is on that, but obviously we are working on those 3 compounds very vigorously.
Great. And then we had another question. Just can you clarify again the relationship between yourselves and Capricor with the development of CAP-1002?
Sure. So Capricor and its product CAP-1002 are being developed by Capricor Therapeutics. They are conducting the HOPE-3 trial, as you can see on the slide there, and they would be responsible for filing this with the FDA and getting the regulatory approval for that. At that point, NS Pharma will be responsible for commercializing that compound. So we're working very closely with them.
Thank you. And then we had a couple of questions that I think probably slide 10 has most of the information. So this was around the Exon 44 study. So just first for some clarification for families, for the muscle biopsies, are these open biopsies or are you all doing needle biopsies?
Um, Eric, I'm not aware of the exact nature of the protocol with respect to biopsies, but I think the type of biopsy is going to be listed in the protocol. And I think this is going to be a discussion, one of the discussions in terms of patient compliance and what kind of biopsies and site and what the site can do or cannot do, and what would be a biopsy that would absolutely be a requirement from the FDA in terms of the quality of the biopsy. And I think all those considerations go into deciding whether the biopsies are open or are they needle biopsies.
I believe there are open biopsies.
Okay, thank you. And then with the MRI testing, both for this and the Exon 50 study, is this just skeletal muscle, or are you also doing cardiac MRI with these?
Leslie, do you want to answer that?
It's mostly skeletal muscle.
And then just as well as the clarification points for the stable dose of glucocorticoids, one question we normally have with this is, are you discriminating between daily and weekend, or as long as the regimen they're on is stable, either one is suitable?
I can answer that, and Leslie, please correct me. I think when we say stable, I think we're entertaining both those regimens. And Eric, you're right. I think stable means that they do stay on the same regimen. If they are daily, they stay daily. And if they're on weekend, they stay weekend and not change between those two.
Right.
Okay. And then similar with the approval and patients starting to have access to Agamree, vamorolone, provided they had the 3 months of stable dosing, that would also be included, correct?
Yes, that is not an investigational product anymore.
Great. And then we did have some questions around some of the exclusion criteria. So we had a few questions asking if you could kind of explain the rationale for excluding patients who've received gene therapy from these trials.
I don't know if it was me, but I think you were cutting off. Maybe it was just me. Eric, could you repeat
Okay.
that question again?
Yeah, so we had questions around the rationale for excluding patients who've received gene therapy from these trials. If you could just provide some background.
Got it. Got it. I think these are in this the both of these are investigational drugs, and they are going through a safety assessment. Um, so to make sure that everything that we assess during these studies are assessment that are related to the investigational drug only, the exclusion criteria in terms of any gene therapy is what is in place. So any kind of gene therapy that children have been exposed to will be considered exclusionary for both the Exon 44 and the Exon 50 skipping trial. Does that answer the question, Eric?
Yeah, I think that was basically the question of why those patients why they were excluded for this one. I think there was a similar question noting that for the Exon 44 study, there is exclusion of any other oligonucleotide, but that wasn't listed on the Exon 50 study. And if you could just again explain the difference there or help clarify.
Yes. For the Exon 44 skipping and the Exon 50 skipping study, any exposure to another exon skipping oligonucleotide is exclusionary. The reason it's listed in 44 and not listed in 50 is because of the possibilities of other coexisting therapies or clinical trials out there that could allow for children who are exon 44 amenable or 50 amenable. It is placed in exon 44 skipping because there could be potentially other therapies. It's not yet placed in 50, because right now, as we look at the clinical trial landscape, there is no other exon 50 trial yet. So that's why it looks different when it is listed as such. But for practical purposes for our listeners, if you are using any other exon skipping oligonucleotide, it is considered exclusionary for both exon 44 and exon 50. Leslie, any other comments from your end?
The only thing I would add is that should an exon 50 skipping agent become available during the course of our study, then it would become a listed exclusionary criteria. At the moment, there were no products that are exon skippers for 50 in clinical trials. So it was sort of a moot point, and that's why the protocol was silent on that.
Thank you.
And then
So
this is
it was mostly a logistical reason, not a philosophical reason as to why we differed.
yeah. And then to follow up on that, because I think we've had a few other questions. I think that there's still a little bit of confusion. So with gene therapy, I think something the community is very kind of clear on is that, once you've been dosed with the gene therapy, washing out of that's not a possibility. With something like an exon skipping therapy, patients, theoretically, you could stop and have a washout. And so I think there was a little bit of wondering, what is the rationale for not being able to wash out if you've previously been on an exon skipping therapy, like you have with the other investigational drugs?
Yeah, and I think the reasoning behind here is more to do with the fact that these are phase 1/2 and phase 2 studies, and they're small studies with small number of participants, and safety is of paramount importance. And any confounder would really anything that confounds a participation and safety analysis would really make analysis at the end very difficult. So I think for those reasons, it is being kept, so to speak, very clean, for lack of a better word, and excluding even the concept of washout, or this washout that has been entertained in other studies, or washout that we talk about with 5.5 half-lives and such. So I think for these two studies, we are excluding any ASO or oligonucleotide study, even if theoretically they could be washed out.
No, thank you. I think that's something that is sometimes challenging, and I understand why, for families to hear whenever some of the choices for why those exclusion are happening. But it's kind of knowing in the background that part of that is to try and have a trial that's designed in the best possible way to show efficacy, so we can have that therapy hopefully be accessible to more patients. And of course, there's discussions around labeling and the ability to make sure that we have that access to everyone. But that is helpful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. And I would just like to add that the nature of these phase 1/2 trials, as you have seen from the timeline, is they are 24-week trials. So the hope is that once we do establish with the best possible clinical trial design and timing, that it is safe, and we are going to go into it is safe, and secondary endpoints, there are some efficacy endpoints built in, and we feel confident that we're going to go into phase 3. It's a short timeline to then allow for kids to then come into a phase 3, and then Pharma will decide based on protocols and what they have found, what phase 3 criteria will look like. So more to come there.
Mm-hmm. And then there's no, for the exon 44 study, there is no placebo group, correct?
Yes.
Just wanted to clarify, since sometimes when we're seeing multiple studies, just that way the details aren't kind of being lost. So they will go to, in part 2, whatever the highest tolerated dose, all patients will transition to that. Will there be an open label extension for those patients in the Exon 44 study?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Leslie's saying yes. Yeah.
And then if we go to slide 15, which is more about the Exon 50. So just to clarify here in part 2, so part 1 does have a placebo. You said the randomization was 2 to 1. In the part 2 study, is there a placebo within this group as well?
No, I don't believe so, Leslie. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And then we just had, I'm going to keep scrolling through the questions. So again, if you have any questions, please submit them there. Some of the ones that we had, though, that were submitted before, and these are going to be a little bit, I think, broader questions, not specific details, but maybe some scientific rationale. But we did have a question around inclusion of young manifesting female carriers. So those, young girls who could potentially be amenable to an Exon 44 and an Exon 50 skipping product. Are they able to be enrolled in these studies? And just, from NS's standpoint of thinking about including potentially female carriers, manifesting carriers.
For these 2 study designs, they are specifically including DMD boys. And I think part of the reason for that is for the same reason Dr. Rao mentioned earlier. We have only 20 patients in total in each of these studies. And you want to make each of those patients as similar to one another as possible to help strengthen what your result would be, what the power of detecting a result would be based on a small clinical sample size.
Thank you. And then we also had some questions coming in asking about international participation or NS's plans for potentially conducting studies in other countries. As of right now, the study sites are US and Japan.
So for these 2 phase 2 studies, again, for the same reason, small sample size, want to keep things as consistent as possible. We are just opening sites in Japan and the US. Most likely, as was done with our Brogidirsen studies, once it entered the phase 3 and we had a much larger sample size, we did broaden the sites to include global representation.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll try to make sure as those plans come out that we keep kind of the community updated on the opportunities there. And then we had some more, I think, questions in the maybe research vein. So we did have a question come in asking about, and I will say I've talked to many families at conference where they might have a child or know people who could potentially benefit from the use of, 2 exon skipping products, where that's what would be needed to help facilitate restoring a reading frame. Is that something that you're looking at in any kind of research capacity for the combination of the exon skipping therapies that you're developing?
At the moment, we are not, but it is certainly scientifically intriguing and an important question. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some evolution to that. I know people are also looking at it for patients who have a duplication of a specific exon and skipping over just that one. Again, not something formally studied, but very scientifically intriguing and important as well. So some of those answers may come about as clinicians themselves begin utilizing these products as they become commercially available.
Yeah. And then we had a question just around, again, some of the companies have been exploring conjugated PMO. And so for anyone who's, newer terms, whether that's combining the PMO with a peptide or an antibody fragment or an antibody, is that something that NS has been exploring at all?
That is something that our clinical research team in Japan is certainly looking at. And I don't have any more details about it, but obviously aware of it and would certainly be looking into things.
And then for both these studies, is it restricted to just ambulatory patients? And if
Yes.
so, what are the plans then for moving to and studying the compounds in non-ambulatory populations?
At the moment, we're very focused on these two studies and getting these up and running. Again, if you want to look at our example with Brogidirsen, once our basic studies were completed, we did do a second study in ambulatory and non-ambulatory patients to gain further information about that. So if an analogous situation happens and we're doing it that way, that may be the case, but at this moment, I can't promise what the next study up will be.
And then we can certainly include some of those links, but if families have kind of further questions or looking for information about the sites and where they can potentially enroll for these trials, kind of where's the best place for them to be directed to? Do you have a site, an email contact, or is it the QR codes that you had linked in the webinar?
So the link is to the clinicaltrials.gov. And if you look on that site, you will see the various sites listed. So for 44, as you saw, there were about 10 already listed. And if you then want to find out who you should be speaking with specifically at the site, you can call that 1-866 number that was listed. It's 1-866 NS-PHARM, PHARM, and they have the specific clinical study coordinators' names at those sites that they can provide to you, so you can get more in-depth information about moving forward with that site. There's only one site presently for NS-050, as Dr. Rao mentioned, but as soon as we get more online and up and running, those will be added to clinicaltrials.gov as well. And then you can follow the same procedure by calling that toll-free number, which will give you the name of a specific person at each site that you should reach out to.
And is NS providing travel support to go to the various sites across the country?
I believe they are, but that would be through the clinical development group and the clinical trial site. But I believe they are, as we have done that in the past. Dr. Rao, as a site, would you have information on that?
My experience has been that most of the trials do provide support, as Leslie's mentioned. I would again emphasize that once you talk to the local site and get in touch with the clinical research coordinator at the local site, you could have a list of questions, and some of those questions could be related to support. And the clinical research coordinators, depending on where you are located, can always again confer with NS Pharma and give you more details about the exact nature of the support.
Correct.
And then for families that are looking, and if this is maybe the first time you're considering participating in a clinical trial, we do have a list of recommended questions on the PPMD website that you can kind of take with you in that informed consent process. That way you kind of feel like you are well informed as you decide to participate. So please feel free to use that as a resource as well. And then, yeah, we can make sure that when we host this, that the links and the phone number are listed. So that way, if families have any additional questions about participation, it's easy to find. But I don't see any other additional questions coming in at the moment. So just like to thank Leslie and Dr. Rao for taking the time to walk us through the two designs for these studies. And appreciate everyone joining online and asking all of your questions. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.